we're getting demand from various regions and task teams. And one of the topics which is very important as we go forward is that all the innovations which are happening in the digital space on service delivery are happening through a number of startups. On the last count, we have Sunil, you need to work out. John says that he's getting terrible sound. So we need to work that out. Is this problem with John or everyone is okay?
I think the problem is with John. It's working well at my end.
So John, you need to change your settings a little bit. So maybe it will work then. Yeah. But I appreciate you giving feedback because otherwise we'll not even know what's happening. Thanks a lot. So, worldwide, a lot of services are now getting increasingly delivered by startups and private sector players in this space. And the World Bank teams sometimes find it since we are working primarily with the government, we find it very difficult on how do we work to enable a number of these innovators and private sector to come and work with us. We generally don't have good diagnostics on whom we should work with, how we should work with them, and what are the ways this has been working out in various countries. Some of our early projects like Kenya and all developed a platform with innovators, and that led to development of new ways of working with startups. Now, also our IFC is also thinking of developing a fund to invest in these startups. So if we are able to do this in a kind of a complementary kind of way, this could be a very interesting way of doing things. So we thought today we have a number of panelists who are working on this ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem and the startup ecosystem. They will tell us what's happening in this field. And in end, we will come out with some recommendations for the various teams and also engage you in a discussion, because this is not a typical webinar in which we only look at the chat questions. We will encourage you to come in at some stage, after every presenter is done. Maybe if we can take a couple of questions concurrently, it will be good to do it like that rather than have 3-4 presentations and then have discussion. So we will try to break it up a little bit. Clinics are not like webinars. They are clinics in which we have to have a two-way street there. So I would request Mary Agnes, who's going to moderate that, to after every presentation, give some time for people to reflect and ask 1 or 2 questions if they have. And then rest of the questions we will harvest from the chat. And please put on your questions in the chat on what issues you are seeking guidance and knowledge there. And so I would encourage you to ask questions and ask clarifications, because this is the topic on which we are going to work quite a bit in our operations. So over to you, Mary Agnes, for moderating the rest of the session.
Thank you, Parmesh. I think you said most of the core elements, so I will not delay further. I would like first to, we have 2 different types of companies who have been working with us until now to develop some background documents to really help us, unfold what's going on in this ecosystem and how we can tackle it. So what is going to be shared with you today is based on a few guidebooks that have been and pilots that are ongoing, actually. So there's one guidebook on innovation challenge that our colleagues have done. InSkip here in the room has done the guidebook for the development of startup ecosystem in agriculture and food. And we have also Brighter Bridges here with David, who is developing a pilot that he will say a few words about a bit later, and for which we will also probably make a call for interest for some deep dives on a few countries to test the interest, and how TTL would respond to this information that we will bring together. So here today we have the opportunity to deep dive a little bit into these documents and what's been developed, but also have this interaction with some of the experts, which quite frankly, I keep on learning a lot from them. It's a whole different world, a whole different jargon. So We're also going to be careful today to not completely drown you with too much startup ecosystem jargon. The objective is to showcase that there are opportunities and there's a lot going on, and there are many new kinds of approaches and tools we can develop with governments and with the ecosystem to get that done. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Maxime Guillot, he's an entrepreneur and founder of InSkip, which is a French company dedicated to nurturing entrepreneurial ecosystem. He has played a vital role in establishing multiple investment funds and acceleration programs, aiming to foster robust and integrated ecosystem in Africa and in Europe. So he's specializing in startups, fintech industry, health, and food sectors. And so he's also a mentor for a lot of startups and guiding them through their go-to-market strategies and financing issues. So Maxime, over to you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well, and I'm deeply honored to introduce what we do at InSkip. Of course, I'll try to be as short as I can to give space to the knowledge and the expertise of the guidebook and what we've done for the previous months. Just to give you a very small introduction, we are 40 people worldwide, mostly entrepreneurial people, committed to fostering sustainable development and economic growth and working with all the major third parties. We are proud to put our DNA, which is a strongly consulting and also strongly entrepreneurial driven, to empower the ecosystems and the community we work with and to try to drive them to transform themselves. So we try to put these two DNA into action. The consulting skills and the knowledge, of course, will bring the strategy, the data, the way to structure everything, and of course the entrepreneurial DNA will put us on the field to try to be very specific, to measure, to get the right KPIs and to measure the impact we have. Thanks for joining us today. If I just swap to what we do, we mostly do 3 different things to help our clients and the ecosystems that we're building. We think we make and we grow, which allows us to be on the whole value chain and to ensure that all ecosystems have the right and the proper skills, knowledge, background and regulatory background to work properly. And so we operate in 3 different countries. We work in France, in Germany, in Dubai, and in Morocco. Thanks to that, we address projects pretty much worldwide. And just to focus on the ecosystem and of course the agriculture, the Agtech ecosystems, we've been working on 2 different steps. The first step was to build what we've called the guidebook, thanks to that consulting and knowledge skills that we have, to try to gain more perspectives on what works and what doesn't work, and what could be replicated or what we've seen in different countries that do work and that could be potentially identified as key success factors and best practices in the agriculture or food Agtech ecosystems. And of course, we're going to move to the second part, trying to put that in reality or in real life, how to implement that now and crash test all these kind of ideas on real ecosystems to try to build stronger ecosystems. We've been working in Morocco right now with the Ministry of Agriculture and the World Bank to do so and to try to connect all these third parties that are necessary to build an ecosystem. Of course, it's complex. All the stakeholders need to be around the table, and we need to create strong connections, strong collaborations, create solid programs and great financial supports to build and support an ecosystem. And I'll give the flow now to Lena, who's been working on this with the team. Of course, she was not alone doing this, and you're going to present the major outputs of the guidebooks we've been doing for the last 10 months.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining. So thank you, Maxime. Indeed, we have been working with the World Bank, and it's a a good example, as he mentioned, of a mission we have been doing at INSCIP that mixes the knowledge basis that needs the World Bank and its clients that we've done with the guidebook, and I'll give you more information about that. But also it shows that we are also on the ground in the different countries, and we can implement the different best practices we have identified, and we are currently doing so with Morocco and the Ministry of Agriculture and the World Bank there in Morocco, the GTLs in Morocco. So if you want to know more about the work we are doing there, do not hesitate to contact us after the clinic. To come back to the guidebook and the general context of this clinic as well, as you all know, there have been major investments in the Agtech sector in the past few years, but there are still some objectives, some challenges that we haven't been able to solve so far, especially regarding increasing yields to try and feed the world, to put it simply, but also to try and gain and develop more sustainable agricultural practices to make sure we are in line with the different concerns of the climate and the environment, but also in line with what the consumers want and what we need to put in place around the world. So the purpose of the guidebook was really to try and facilitate the development and scaling of Agtech startup ecosystems in emerging countries especially. And for that, we have based our methodology on the understanding of 10 different use cases to try and identify best practices, such as activities to implement, partnerships to put in place, or investment programs to try and support, to try and make these ecosystems live, but also thrive on the long term. So the different case studies that we looked at are the 10 ones you can see on the screen now. I will not go into the full detail of each one, but it's in the guidebook and we can absolutely share it with you if you want to deep dive more. But just to give you an idea, we try to have different points of views. So we have some initiatives that are backed by private corporates, other ones that are backed by GFIs, such as the World Bank, other ones by governments directly. And we try to have a look at different levels of maturity as well. You can see nascent, intermediate, and advanced, to make sure that we gain best practices from the best ones in the world, let's say, the advanced countries in Agtech, but also to try and see what worked well in countries that are less developed, but that have put in place initiatives that are aligned with the needs on the ground. To assess for these different maturity levels, we have developed a tool that is really practical, that is based on a matrix of 6 different dimensions that allows to get a score out of 10 when you answer a set of questions related to the ecosystem. So the ecosystem can be a country, can be a program, it can be a startup itself, it can be on different macro levels, but the idea is to get a score out of 10, and depending on this score, you get a different maturity level, and depending on the maturity level you will have access to different insights and different enablers. And the goal is really to find enablers that are aligned with your maturity level. You will not have to put in place the same initiatives if you are a nascent ecosystem rather than if you are more developed. Now to go into more details about the challenges that we identified during the interview phase, but during also the different analysis that we've made when making this guidebook. We have 6 major challenges that come back at the different levels of the value chain, at the different levels of maturity, but also at the different places around the globe. The first one is the access to data. It's really difficult to access reliable data that can be transparent and that can be used easily by the different actors of the value chain. The second one is related to financing, especially for early stages. It's really difficult to make these investments less risky. The third one is fitting the market. We realize that there is a big gap between the innovation and the solutions that the startups are proposing and the actual reality on the ground and what the farmers and the actors on the field really need, especially when they don't have high revenues. The fourth one is related to acculturation. the entrepreneurial mindset is not something that we can find in every actor, especially in public actors. I think you have realized that also with your clients, and it's something that needs to be figured out and that needs to be also clearly defined in governance. The fourth one is the ecosystem itself. There are different actors doing different things, but it's really important to try and find a way to align incentives and find a way to propose solutions that are connected within the whole ecosystem. And the last one, but not least, is related to regulations. Technology is moving fast, and we need to find a way to put in place new legal frameworks and facilitate also administrative procedures between countries, but also within the same country. And now what I want to do is go into each one of these challenges to share with you some experience we had at Inkscape that shows how we or our client contributed to finding a way to solve this issue. So for the first one, related to financing, we have in our case studies in the guidebook talked with Proparco, which is the financing branch, the private branch of AFG. I think you all know it. And they have developed an enabler that is really interesting. That is a financial tool that allows to give investment between different stages. They call that a bridge fund. And it's something that they have put in place that has allowed to finance a lot of startups that couldn't find financing during this phase between seed and Series A, for example. Another example that we have developed in Morocco with one of our clients is 212 Founders. It's a program that is launched by a public actor, the commission deposit in Morocco. And the goal was really to find a way to develop these startups that were already in Morocco on the ground, but that couldn't find financing. So they had access to a 50 million euros investment fund that gathered the public actor, so the CDG, but also private stakeholders like business angels and other investment funds like VCs that were less reluctant to invest in this program because the startups were being supported with an incubation program, an acceleration program that allowed them to be coached and to prepare for this fundraising and to use the money efficiently afterwards. They had access to this whole program and it allowed them to scale and then to get even more financing when they left the program. For the second challenge related to the market itself and finding product market fit, as I said before, it's really important to propose solutions that are in line with what we really need, whether it's from the farmers' needs or the other actors' needs. And an example we have here is, I think you know the group Vinci in France, that is a leader in energy and in construction. And we have been working with them for the past few years to create Leonard, which is an innovation hub, which is part of the corporate group that is developing programs for entrepreneurs, but also for startups. So external startups can also apply to the program. And they have access to financing, but especially they have access to the network of Vinci, which is huge in France, but also around the world. They have different subsidiaries around the world, and it allows to give direct access to a market that can get their needs to the startups. So for example, if a startup is working on energy, they will talk with the Vinci teams in Africa, and the Vinci teams in Africa will explain what are the different needs of the subsidiaries there, and they will develop solutions for them. So they already have a market even before developing the solution. And it's something that has been working really well in the different startups we have accompanied so far, which are more than 100. The third challenge is related to the entrepreneurial culture. It is difficult, especially in public actors, but we have succeeded in one of the programs we launched in Morocco as well. It is part of, it was launched by AFG, and the goal was to develop public startups. We call them startup data, so state startups. So the goal is really to try and make public sector employees become entrepreneurs. It's a model that works in France that is called Betagouv, and we tried to implement it in Morocco by adapting it, of course, to the regulations there, but also to the way the public sector is working. And we have launched 2 pilot projects, one within the central bank and another one with the youth ministry in Morocco. And both of them were successes because they were able to develop a governance and a way of cracking the mindsets within these public agencies and proving that such startup mindsets can work also within these organizations. And after being financed by the AFG for approximately a year and a half, they did a committee with the bank and the ministry to show the KPIs and the impact it had on the agencies. And because it was a success, the financing was then moved to the agencies itself. The fourth challenge is related to supporting ecosystems. So making sure that you have a lot of actors, but making sure that they are all in the same room and they are all providing some sort of support to the startups themselves. A good example is Innovex, which is a venture builder that we created for OCP, which is one of the major leaders in the phosphate market in Africa, but also around the world. And what is really amazing in this mission itself is that they were able to develop a venture builder that will create but also scale startups. But around this venture builder, they have connected with an investment fund that is within OCP. Another acceleration program called Plug and Play that is also within the same place in Morocco. They have also access to the corporate OCP itself, which can become a client for the startups that are being accompanied. And they have also partnerships with a university that is related to OCP as well. So it's a really complete ecosystem. It has shown that it is important to build a strong network and knowledge around the startups to facilitate the way they are working and to facilitate their scale-ups afterwards. The fifth challenge is related to regulations. So as we said before, it's really important to facilitate procedures related to admin or regulations or law in general. There are good best practices to look at in the Middle East, especially in Dubai, for example, which is one of our case studies. But we were able to do it also in Morocco because we developed called a startup policy, trying to make sure that the technology transfer can be facilitated between the researchers and the moment they want to become startuppers, so deep tech founders usually. And for that, we had to talk with the different public entities related to technology transfer, related to IP, to make sure everyone is in line and that the policy framework can be facilitated for these researchers. And at the end of this mission, we have a policy that is acknowledged by all these different actors that really allows to create more startups per year, related to deep tech, related to energy, related to Agtech, and all these subjects that are always reliable, that always rely on research. Sorry. And the last challenge is related to data. So what I wanted to say on this part is really that we realize that there are 2 types of data, whether it's market data, ecosystem data, so a way to really try to go to market to find customers and having data on this market itself, so the number, the population or things like that. But it's also important to have access to foundational data, so data related to the crops, to the climate, to the yields, all these different data to make it accessible and transparent to the different actors, but especially to startups, to facilitate their development and also to lower their acquisition costs and their analysis costs, because it's something that costs a lot to access this data, to buy it and to analyze it. And when you're a startup, especially at seed stage, it can become a hurdle and it can make the startup die very soon. So I finished with the different challenges. I just wanted to say thank you again for listening. And if you have any questions, or if you want to access the guidebook or talk about these different challenges more in details, Maxime and I are really eager to answer.
Thanks a lot, Lina. All my apologies, you didn't get a proper introduction. My WebEx crashed. Hopefully it's going to hold now. So let me introduce you now so that people know how relevant you are for this. So you're a manager at Inskip, but you co-founded an Agtech project dedicated to drawing the future of agriculture through innovative solutions by identifying some data-driven technologies which can solve pain points through the agriculture value chain. And you have experience in biotech, in wellness startups, and you specialize in creating innovation vehicles such as startup programs or digital business unit for corporates and public actors in Morocco and Africa. And right now, Inskip is actually quite heavily involved in Morocco with really helping with their strategy. Unfortunately, I think Remy, who's the detail on this, could not join us today, but you know, we could. If there's interest, we could, I'm sure you can say a few words in place of Remy about the key elements of this program in Morocco. Now, we've heard of all these different challenges. You know, this is something you can find in a guidebook. Maxime and Lina have shared with you, you know, a bit more of where this knowledge from the guidebook is coming from for their actual experience. And you can see there are many ways in which we can solve some of these issues, and different countries having different issues because there's the legacy system, different dynamics that you inherit when you start investing into the startup ecosystem. Now, we will bring in Brighter Bridges and David, whom I'm going to introduce in a second, but just as a brief intro, what David is going to share is more about the fact that indeed with this legacy system and where you're coming from, different countries of different size have adopted different strategies in terms of being more attractive or supporting their ecosystem. So, you know, here you've heard about the different challenge, but David is going to give you a few examples of how in different countries what that meant in terms of their dynamic in their Agtech ecosystem. So David Saunders is director at Brighter Bridges, and he's the lead of their recently launched Ag-based program, which is a multi-year program funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. And it's to increase investments in innovation in Agtech in Africa. So it's going to be a very useful database for all of us, I think. And so David has over a decade of experience working in innovative financing in emerging markets. And most recently has been working with a range of public and private sectors to help shape investments into innovation ecosystems across Africa with a specific focus on agriculture, climate, finance, and deep tech. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Maria Agnes, and thanks so much, Lena, for the presentation on the challenges and some of the case studies on how they've been addressed to support Agtech ecosystems around the world. I'm going to quickly pull up my presentation here. Okay, great. So as Maria Agnes said, I think, you know, in terms of what Lena was showing previously, there's a lot of different approaches that you can take in order to help stimulate your Agtech ecosystems as a way to attract more funding, as a way to support innovation, and as well as a way to create this kind of entrepreneurial culture. What we're going to look at now in terms of this presentation from Brighter Bridges is we have over a decade of data on startup ecosystems across sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, some data in South Asia, and some data in Latin America as well. And we're going to look at that data and see how different types of policy interventions or interventions by both the public and private sector have helped in terms of increasing or accelerating startup ecosystems. And we're not going to exclusively focus on Agtech ecosystems here. We're going to look at what we can also learn kind of more generally from how different ecosystems have approached this. And there's three kind of focuses to this presentation today. So the first is I'm just going to introduce a little bit of the language that I'm going to be using throughout the presentation. A lot of it is to describe different types of policy interventions, but also the data that we're sharing on behalf of Brighter Bridges. We're then going to look at 5 ecosystem case studies. They are all from sub-Saharan Africa. And I know this group of participants is beyond sub-Saharan Africa, but I think we'll find that there's some insights that are applicable to whatever region or whatever market that you're operating in. And then the third is I'm going to share a little bit about a project that the World Bank and Maria-Agnes, Parmesh, and myself are working on together in terms of how we can make this data and information accessible to you so that it can help with the work that you guys are doing within your countries and regions too. So yeah, as I was saying, before we start, just demystifying some of the language in the presentation. So 2 of the key data points that we'll be using throughout the presentation are number of deals and volume of funding. So the number of deals refers to individual transactions, not the amount of money invested, but just the number of transactions done. And in this sample, we include equity, debt, and grants. So one of the phenomena that we see within sub-Saharan Africa, but I think in the ag tech space and probably global, it's just the different types of financing instruments that are used to stimulate the ecosystems and sectors within ecosystems at different stages of maturity. The second is then volume funding. This complements the number of deals. This is the amount of money invested by funders. So this is when you read those headlines, $100 million invested in, Twiga Foods or something like this. That's the volume of funding, whereas that would register as one deal in terms of the number of deals that we're looking at. And then just in terms of giving an overview of what we mean by investors, I think everybody here knows what an investor is, but in terms of who we're including in that, we actually look quite broadly at funders. There's a range of different funders, as Lena was just showing, that have been active in ag tech ecosystems and ecosystems across sub-Saharan Africa, ranging from accelerators and incubators to corporates to donors to DFIs to impact investors and venture capital firms. And you'll see that a lot of these different investors come together when they're looking to make investments as well. The next is ecosystem support organizations. This is one of those terms that everybody kind of in the startup space throws around. It really means organizations that provide technical support to startups. So you have this with the type of accelerators or incubators that help businesses at the early stage, innovation hubs that might provide support to entrepreneurs, governments that can come in and also support research organizations. I think a lot of us are familiar with CGIAR that does this, and then venture builders who get very actively involved in supporting startups themselves. And then the last term, which comes up quite a bit in this presentation, is a fund of funds. So I think one of the things that I quite liked about the way the World Bank's thinking about this, and also INSCIP, is kind of what are the interventions that enablers can do for different stages of ecosystem maturity. And one of the kind of enablers of enablers is providing funding to local funds that can then support startups within the ecosystem. So fund of funds don't actually directly invest in startups or companies. They actually invest in the funds that invest in startups or companies. And you'll see throughout the presentation how that's been utilized by a few different ecosystems. So let's get into the ecosystem case studies. So there's 5 case studies we're going to look at. We're going to look at different types of approaches that different countries have taken to stimulating their ecosystems. So the first, which a lot of potentially the audience or definitely Lena, myself, Maria-Agnes, and Parmesh are familiar with, is Kenya. There we're going to be looking at how they've unlocked innovation through public-private partnerships. The second is we're going to look at South Africa, really about how they've been mobilizing local capital. So this will come back to that fund of funds point. The third, we'll be looking at Tunisia, where they've taken a unique approach as a small country to unlock and catalyze innovation within their market. And then 2 markets that have taken very different approaches in sub-Saharan Africa with very different outcomes, Rwanda and Mauritius, in terms of how they've positioned themselves differently in order to attract funding and innovation to those markets as well. Before we start out, just to kind of contextualize these different markets. So Kenya and South Africa sit on the much more mature end of ecosystems in Africa. They're 2 of the big 4, so they're 2 of the countries that have attracted the majority of funding and deal flow over the last decade. There's then quite a big drop-off outside of the big 4 to the rest of the startup ecosystems across Africa. So the big 4, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and Egypt. And these countries then, once you fall out of them, you get to much smaller markets with a different type of context in which they need to make themselves attractive to startups and investors for. And I think it's quite interesting to kind of show these, because if you're a Kenya or South Africa, you might be able to take one pathway and one approach, where if you're a small market like Rwanda, Tunisia, Mauritius, or in Eastern Europe, say in Estonia, you've had to do something slightly different in order to make yourself attractive and to think quite differently in terms of how you go about stimulating innovation and investment. So in terms of Kenya, what we can see, over the last 10 years is really quite a lot of growth in the startup ecosystem, both in terms of deal flow and venture, and in terms of funding as well. What's been particularly interesting in Kenya as well, the majority of the world has really felt this fall off over the last year, 2 years in terms of venture capital funding. Kenya has actually remained more resilient, particularly in terms of deal flow. And one of the major drivers of that has actually been these partnerships between public investors and private investors. And I think that can often be seen as a negative. Oh, this ecosystem is very reliant on public funding as a way for it to remain resilient, to remain sustainable. But what we've actually seen within Kenya and other ecosystems across sub-Saharan Africa is that these public funding has actually played a role in unlocking and catalyzing the overall ecosystem. And Kenya has probably been one of the ecosystems that has benefited the most from this. They by far have the most public funders that have been active in actually doing deals across sub-Saharan Africa. And you also see it in the type of sectors that funding has gone to as well, such as climate, ag tech, and health. And I think I saw one of the questions in the chat just now around, how do you think about gender? And one of the very interesting things about Kenya as well is it's out of the big four, it has the lowest gender gap in terms of financing to startups with women-only founders. And the public sector has definitely played a role in that in terms of shaping how that funding goes, but also because of the sectors for which this public funding has been driving, such as ag tech and health, you actually find a lot more startups with women-only founders in those areas. So the public investors can actually play a role, not just helping to sustain the investment ecosystems, but also direct where that funding goes to and unlock more private funding. And while these numbers look quite big in terms of Kenya versus South Africa versus Mauritius, most of these markets, even Kenya, for example, this makes up less than 10% of the total deal flow within Kenya. So there's 90% of deal flow still coming from outside of the public sector. They've just played a big role in terms of unlocking funding and also de-risking that funding into certain spaces. And in Kenya in particular, this has been quite a success story because there's been so many different DFIs that have been involved there. It hasn't just been one or two. When we look at South Africa has a slightly different context to itself, but similarly to Kenya, its deal flow has also remained resilient. South Africa is often not looked at as a market by donors or DFIs. I spent 12 years working there for a think tank. One of the things that we often found is that South Africa had a much more active private sector that played the role that typically, DFIs might play in other markets in terms of supporting different socioeconomic outcomes. And they have quite a strong private sector as well, quite a number of active corporates. And what they've done quite interestingly in terms of mobilizing funding is the government has actually partnered with the private sector to set up something called a SME fund. This was a partnership between government, which put up funding from pension funds with private sector, such as corporates and financial institutions that put private financing together to mobilize $100 million into a fund of fund structure. So this comes back to what I was saying before. These SME fund doesn't directly invest in startups or small businesses. They actually invest in the funds that they can go on and invest in those as well. And if you look at when the establishment of the SME fund was in 2018, you see quite a rapid increase in terms of the deal flow, in terms of startup ecosystems. And it's been so successful that in this last year, they were actually oversubscribed for a VC fund of funds, so specifically targeting venture capital in 2023. And they were actually able to attract more government funding and more private funding into that because they had seen the positive impact that that had had on the overall ecosystem over that time. And when you look at South Africa in terms of this graph here, compared to the rest of ecosystems across sub-Saharan, the other case studies here, you actually see that they have a much larger share of investors that are local. And this has been pretty important because over the last 2 or 3 years, what we've seen is the kind of startup ecosystem, what they call foreign tourists or tourist investors. So foreign funders that came in during kind of the peak periods in 2021, 2022, and now have withdrawn. And that's really affected markets like Nigeria and Egypt, whereas South Africa has remained more resilient because they have this homegrown local ecosystem as well. And a critical enabler of this has also been this role that the SASME fund has been playing, particularly in terms of first loss capital. So in terms of de-risking, more and more investments from other funders as well into these funds themselves. So this is an example of how government and private sector can work together to really unlock and mobilize local funding into the startup ecosystem. Whereas in Kenya, what we saw is the way that donors and DFIs can work together with the private sector to de-risk innovation into certain sectors, certain areas where they can have quite a high impact. So those are two markets that were big, right? They have a lot of things working for them ready, relatively higher incomes, big populations, more mature financial sectors and industry across the board. When we look at Tunisia, which is a smaller country in North Africa, what they've been very, what they saw as an opportunity was how do they differentiate themselves? How do they position themselves as a destination for innovation and funding as well? And they took an ecosystem approach to this. So if in the first two examples, what I've highlighted is how you can look at specifically mobilizing funding. In this example, we look at is how do you take a market systems or ecosystem approach as a small country to really unlocking that as well. And I think this really gets at the heart of what I understand the World Bank and INSCIP are also looking at within the work that they're doing together, which is how do they take an ecosystem approach to catalyzing innovation and investment. And the first thing that Tunisia did, or Tunisia took a three-prong approach. One was they defined the space for startups. This often sounds silly, but we just did a project in Namibia with the World Bank as well. And one of the biggest things that that the ecosystem struggled with and what financial institutions struggled with was how do I differentiate between a high growth SME and a startup? What do I even define a startup as? How do I relate myself to the startup ecosystem? And by defining that space and helping to clarify what startups are and what they're not and what's included in that, you can help people locate themselves within that context as well. The second thing that what also came with that was a lot of startups for the first time registered themselves as startups, and the Tunisian government actually had a platform where they could then increase the visibility of these startups. So more local institutions were actually aware of what was going on, and they found that there was a lot more activity than they were thinking. The second thing is after defining that space, helping to support startups, helping to show that they're prioritizing this within their market. They also then provided funding and technical support to the ESOs, the support organizations around it. One of the big challenges that ESOs have is sustainability and expertise. And how do they keep up with constant current trends? And we've seen this within the Agtech space as well, which is a lot of accelerators, a lot of incubators being started, being closed down, not being able to necessarily get the support and expertise they need to provide to Agtechs as well. So how do you actually help to strengthen that as well? And that was something that Tunisia really prioritized. And then the last is this concept of a fund of funds. They also went about how can they use their tools that they have a government in order to help set up a fund of fund structure. And similar to South Africa, they leveraged local pension funds, they leveraged local financial institutions, and then they also went out and raised funds internationally as well. They could also be in that fund of funds that could help in terms of supporting their local ecosystem. And they've had quite, I mean, the deals have been kind of a bit up and down. I think we're probably missing a little bit of data for 2023, but they have been quite a success case for a few very big startups that have done very well. InstaDeep in the AI space, Expensia and FinTech. They're also emerging at the forefront of food production as well within North Africa. So they've really done well in terms of establishing this local innovative ecosystem and funding that can complement it. So now going a little bit farther, let's say southeast, we look at Rwanda. Rwanda has been really, really interesting because again, Rwanda is a small landlocked country. How did they position themselves to the rest of the world in terms of being a destination for innovation? And I think similar to what they've done in their wider market, they've applied that similarly within the startup ecosystem, where they've made themselves a very attractive destination for foreign startups and entrepreneurs. They're telling startups and investors and entrepreneurs, come here, come test your models in Rwanda. We know it's not going to be your final destination, but you can come and you can have a safe space in order to innovate. And we can also assist you in terms of expanding into other markets next, such as Kenya, which is one of their neighbors. And they've done this with a few different startups. So the first very famous one was a health drone startup called Zipline, which they actually were the first country to allow them to come and test. their innovations in terms of pharmaceutical deliveries. They've done it more recently with Ampersand, which is using battery as a service for e-bodas. And there are other examples as well. And that's really made Rwanda a destination for people and entrepreneurs and startups to think about, which has helped bring innovations there. And then in 2019, they also made it very easy for foreign entrepreneurs that wanted to come and start a business in Rwanda to come there with this W-2 entrepreneurship visa. So there are things that you can do, even in terms of if you're worried that you don't have this homegrown talent, that you can actually help bring that in, where you can have some type of spillover effects into the wider ecosystem. And Rwanda has done this quite successfully, and they're constantly encouraging startups to come and test their innovation. As a result, they have one of the highest percentages of startups that operate in Rwanda, but are not necessarily registered there compared to other markets. So they've really done this job in terms of becoming a destination for innovation. Mauritius has taken a very different approach. So I think one of the things that Lina was also looking at within her presentation was, what are things you can do on the policy and regulatory front as well to encourage yourself to be a place where startups and investors want to come. And Mauritius has done this very well in terms of the type of policies and regulations they put in place around foreign exchange, IP, reducing restrictions on foreign owners, and being a very favorable place for startups to register. A lot of startups and investors, as a result, register there as a holdco, similar to what they might do in Delaware in the US. But they also have quite a strong financial services industry in Mauritius. So they've attracted a lot of fintechs as well in order to set themselves up there. And as a result, this small island off the coast of East Africa has done very well in terms of bringing in deal flow, volume of funding. And what you can see there is that they have a relatively large startup ecosystem, but say unlike what you're seeing in Tunisia and South Africa, they don't have a very locally active ecosystem. So they have very few local investors. The majority of investors there have set up holdcos where they're investing elsewhere in the country as well. And even startups that are registered in Mauritius don't actually operate there. They've just used it as a place where they can register themselves, and they might be operating, say, in a Rwanda or South Africa, or South Africa in particular, where they might find a harder regulatory environment. So I'm not kind of commenting on any of the kind of impact that these different approaches have had, or whether they're good or bad. It just shows you that there's very different pathways that you can take if you're looking to accelerate your ecosystem. And smaller countries really need to think differently than bigger countries about how they attract funding and how they attract startups as well to want to be there. What I do think, though, emerges across all of them and aligns with what Lina was speaking about as well, is that they'll require some interventions around mobilizing funding and support for the ecosystem. You see all of them playing where the public sector does play a role in terms of de-risking innovation and funding. And this is a big place where the World Bank can come in terms of how they're looking at being this enabler of enabler, in terms of also advising governments on what type of fund structures can really de-risk. You also see that the government doesn't just have to do regulation and policy. They can also become an enabler just by positioning themselves and marking themselves as a friendly environment to foreign investors and foreign startups as well. A lot of these markets are going to have some level of constrained local financing. So it does become really important to do that, to have this kind of flow of capital and skills and innovations across borders as well. And there is a need to engage the wider private sector too. And all of these markets, it's not just venture capital firms, it's local financial institutions, it's corporates as well. And I think this also gets to some of the input that Lena was speaking about too. So that's the kind of thinking about what is your strategy? What are the different pathways you can take? Do you need to mobilize local funding? Do you need to work with DFIs? Do you need to create this a very favorable policy or regulatory environment to attract more players to your space? Do you need to position yourself as a bed for innovation and take risks in that way? So you can take a number of different approaches that you're looking at when you're trying to stimulate your ecosystem. And as you can see from those examples, those different approaches have a different impacts for those markets. But once you have that, what you need to then know is, who are you actually going to work with within those ecosystems? Who are the enablers that you need to then connect with in order to implement these policies? And that's really behind what this pilot is between Brighter and the World Bank. Looking at this Agtech data and dashboard, they were looking to build as an internal resource to the World Bank task team leaders. The aim of the dashboard is really to at a country level, be able to provide you with information on what are the ag tech solutions that are in that market that can help you to address different use cases that you have. Who are the enablers that you need to work with, the initiatives, the funds, the programs, the hubs, the incubators that can then help you in terms of supporting those ag tech solutions? Who are the funders that you need to connect with in order to help in terms of financing and scaling those? And lastly, what are the potential opportunities for collaboration between some of these ag techs and scaling partners like corporates? So in Kenya, for example, Safaricom has played a role from time to time in helping to distribute different types of financial services. And just to give you a bit of a teaser for the type of data, because we'd love you guys to kind of get involved, share with us what type of information would be helpful for you, help us think through the priority use cases. Just pulling out Madagascar, for example, we've got information, the database will have information on the funding, the deals, what the sectors those deals are going into, who are the top funders, who are the top startups. You can see some of the examples that we have here for Madagascar. There's probably a lot more happening in a lot of cases than you think. Within Morocco as well, thinking again, who are the different organizations that you can be working with? How can we connect you into those, or how can this database help you identify and connect those into you? And all of these will be housed on internal dashboards that will then be available for you. This is an example of one that we built on Deep Tech in Africa with Startup Tunisia. It has a lot of information that you can play around with, sort through as well. And then, as Maria Agnes was saying at the beginning, we recently launched one with the Gates Foundation on Ag Tech in Africa too. You'll have links to these that you can also see, just give you a sense of what type of information and intelligence can be on these types of dashboard, and then thinking about how we integrate it with the priority use cases and information that you're looking for. So thank you very much for the time. That was, I think just as a recap, looking at those different case studies and thinking a little bit in terms of what are the different pathways that you should be considering, or that you could be considering when speaking with the governments that you're working with, or the partners you're working with in country. And then what is the type of data and information that can be really valuable once you've agreed on those, and identifying the right partners to then go ahead and implement those with.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all the three of you for, I found pretty interesting presentations. So just first an announcement at my end. As David mentioned, we are developing these pilots. We're very much hoping to hear from you and to hear about your interest. What is it that you're looking for? What would be useful to you? What are the themes, that you might be interested in? For example, in some countries, it was so organic carbon farming, which startups could we work with in the region, globally, who are the partners we should work with to develop these kind of solutions, or, more generally, how do we develop the ecosystem? We're very much looking forward to interacting with you, and I think we have in the pipeline a call for interest that we will send probably in a couple of weeks with a bit more details of how this could be, moving forward. David already presented you some of the ideas that we had, but hopefully, we can really harvest all your questions and have a bit of a way of selecting some countries for which we could have some deep dives that hopefully can really help you with your current investment projects. So now let me move to some questions that we had from the chat. Some really interesting ones. And I want to start with actually one of the latest one. And I think we could also hear from some of other colleagues who might want to step in for this one. But there was a question and a comment about India and how there's all this work that's been done by the government to support the ecosystem. But Arshia was asking about whether there were some other places with these kind of public-private examples that we could leverage. So I think, we've heard a lot about these public-private examples already here, but maybe for this one, I could call first to Inskip of one example, which I think is in a high-income country, but was really useful, when we talked to the Morocco team and others, including in France. Even though it's a high-income country, there are many difficulties, and answering, mentioning another question about reaching out to farmers, organizing the ecosystem. So maybe we can hear from you, Inskip, at the end, and maybe in Morocco also how they're dealing with this. And of course, David, if you have any other ideas, you can step in after. Over to you, maybe Lina or Max.
Yes, sure. So especially regarding the second part of Arshia's question, right?
Yes.
related to data. Okay, thank you very much, Arsha, for your question. Indeed, the first government I would say that you can look at that has been doing that is France. There is, I'm thinking about two different initiatives that are quite related. The first one is La French Tech. The French Tech. So it's not only related to Agtech, but it's a government initiative that has found a way to make partnerships with the private organizations in France related to startups. And they are implementing a lot of programs, a lot of whether it's related to financing, to accompanying the startups, but really making sure that they have facilitated regulations and also access to data. And for that, they have partnered with Station F, which is one of the main innovation hubs in Paris, but it is known now worldwide. It's a hub where a lot of startups are developing their solutions. It started as a co-working place, but then it became much more than that, because you have corporates there, you have public actors there, and the French Tech is there. So it's a really good example of how they are sharing data between the public actors, the private actors, and the startups within the same environment. And another one that is also interesting is called La Ferme Digitale, so the digital farm, which is a sort of association that gathers multiple Agtech startups in France, and that are working on trying to scale up these different startups by making meaningful partnerships with the different actors of the ecosystem. So they have partnerships with the government. It is also related to data, because the startups have their own farms where they gather their own data, but they also need public data, so national data, and they have made it clear to governments and the Ministry of Agriculture that there needs to be exchanges. And it worked in the past few years, and they have now become a big hub in Agtech in France. Maxime just left the room, but when he comes back, I can also ask him if he wants to add on to this question. And maybe I can answer the first part, which was related to the lack of adoption on the field. For me, it is really related to one of the challenges I was presenting before. It is the fact that startups have the wrong way of doing sometimes, that is to try and develop a solution and just push it on the ground afterwards. And it's something that clearly does not work. It works really at rare occasions. And from our experience, the best way to do it is to first collect the demand side, so from the farmers, but also from other actors, because Agtech startups are not only for farmers. It can be for cooperatives, it can be at another level, it can be for the input providers, it can be for any other actors. And making sure that passing with these different intermediaries, they can do test and learn. So they can test their proof of concept. So they start with a first solution that is not ready for the market, but that can at least, where they can at least get some feedback from the ground and see if it's something that is really needed. And if it is needed, it will be adopted if they find the right business model, of course. But really needs to go the other way around.
Thanks, Tina. If I can add my own experience with the conversations with the ecosystem, is that the struggle is the same, you know, whether it is in Europe, in the US, maybe differently, but or in Africa, is that, you know, it's a change of mindset. You need to convince some farmers that they need to pay for a service, which is not always easy. And quite frankly, in many countries, including in France, they're not ready to pay for the service. So, you know, a lot of governments are thinking about subsidies. So even in France, some of these services are being supported. It's not clear now. And I remember in Morocco, Lina, when we were discussing this, they are actually trying to figure out how to develop some subsidies, you know, because with these type of services, it's not really straightforward. What do you pay for? You know, what's the do you subsidize the fee, etc. So there's a lot of thinking from the public sector side about how to do this. So moving on to another question, I think there was an interesting part on gender. David, you you already addressed this a bit in your conversation, but we had I think you had some interesting insights from South Africa also about a fund that you mentioned to me recently that was focusing on gender. Maybe you can say a few words about that, because it seemed to be working pretty well. And apologies if I misunderstood and maybe put you on the spot on something where you don't have insights, but over to you.
So I think so. Maybe just before jumping into that one, just on the
Sorry.
lack of viability of ag tech startups, I think one of the unique or one of the challenges that you have with a lot of ag tech startups across sub-Saharan Africa and probably South Asia as well, and a bit of Latin America, is that the recipients, the users of the products, have very low incomes, because we're often targeting smallholder farmers with them. And I think one of the things that we've seen in Kenya, there's a soil health startup called Crop Nuts, which does a lot of soil health testing and digital advisory on soil health behavior. But they're currently struggling to reach smallholder farmers because they're not going to be able to get them to pay. The majority of their customers are actually medium and larger scale corporate farmers. And I think one of the things with these ag tech business models that we need to think more creatively about is that perhaps those individuals that use the products might not be the ones that pay for them. And you may have to think about how you have other partnerships. So in the instance of Crop Nuts, they're thinking about how is their information they're collecting relevant for financial institutions or corporates. There's another product in Kenya as well that CGIAR has actually been supporting, which is doing a lot of crop varietal mapping across the country. And they're also mapping farmland as well. And they are thinking about how do they make that business model sustainable. And the reality is they're not going to make it sustainable by getting the farmers to pay for that. What they're now looking at is how does that data then become valuable to seed retailers? They can then use that to better target different areas with their marketing or distribution. How does it become relevant to financial institutions? So I think one of the things with ag tech business models is we need to rethink a little bit around how we make them sustainable, because there's a lot of really great stuff out there, which I think is the point being made in the chat, but how you actually make them viable and sustainable, and actually make them, so that doesn't get in the way of adoption, I think is one of the things that I suspect we're going to see as an increasing trend over the next few years. In terms of gender, one of the interesting things that we have found in the ag tech space in general and agriculture in general is that there is a much higher proportion of startups with women-only founders in those sectors. There's also a much higher proportion of women in agricultural value chains, but that they're just dramatically underfunded. So the financing gap that we look at in terms of ag, or that we look at in terms of all startup ecosystems, is the result of funding perhaps not flowing to sectors where there's a higher presence of women-only startups as part of that. And how do you basically, and I think that's where Kenya has been so successful in terms of directing funding to high impact sectors that then have that knock-on effect. And I think the second thing that we've seen is how do you increase the representation within the ecosystem? So ecosystems that have higher gender balance, higher women participation, are more likely to also have lower funding gaps and lower startup gaps as too between men and women as well. So I think those are two areas where we have seen quite positive outcomes. One is in terms of getting funding into the sectors where women entrepreneurs are, and the second is having more representation of women within the ecosystems as a whole.
Okay, thanks. Now moving on to one question from Asuka, which is asking about the cultural dimension, the change of mindset, and she mentions particularly in the public sector. So I know Inskip, you've been doing that quite a bit, and I think that's part of your core work actually. So can you say a few words about this?
Yes, thank you, Asuka, for your question. So it is clearly difficult to change the mindset of public organizations that have been working with traditional practices for years and years. One thing that has been proved efficient is to, instead of trying to implement a new culture directly throughout the whole organization, is to try and have some sort of how do we say that? So, some sort of different heroes, different representatives of this new dimension. Maybe start with one of the practices, one of the entities within the organizations, or have one in each of the entities, and trying to make them part of some sort of a community, an innovation community internally within the organization, where they can exchange the different challenges they are facing, and where they can have access to different types of coaching. So whether it's management coaching or technological, trying to understand the new technologies they can put in place with their teams or things like that, they need to learn how it works. And when they did, they will share it with the different collaborators they have in their teams. And once you do that, it is like a spider web, and it goes around the different arms of the public organization.
Thanks, Lina. So I see time is running. I would like to give a few more minutes to the questions, and I think definitely if there's interest, we can connect you all afterwards. If not all the questions have been. I see Max. You wanted say a few words after the last question. Go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add information about the data, especially in France, and how the government is currently putting data in open source that is available to all the different stakeholders. They've just created a website where you have approximately around 50 different sources of data that is available and that you can access, plus that you can connect to whatever API or website or AI that you can use. And that data is of course free and available and updated pretty much every week or every month, depending on the data itself. And that was implemented about 10 years ago by the government, and they tried to tackle different sectors, especially agriculture and food. And so I've just put it the URL, the link on the chat if you want to have a quick look.
So thanks, Max. I think data is indeed essential. The government data infrastructure is essential, particularly in agriculture. So we have more examples. I think Parmesh might mention a few things about this after. I just wanted to go to one other question, and to everyone, we'll be happy to put everyone in touch if you need more details. But very briefly, can you address, I think, one question from Yura from IFC about the SME fund? I think maybe, if both on the Brighter Front and Inskip can say a few words. I guess you have different perspective and experience on that. Inskip may be more hands-on with some of these funds and how they work, and we know there are many different types of them. Maybe David, if you want to start because it was your example, and just be brief if possible. We have 2 minutes to finish before I leave the floor to Parmesh and to some TTLs who might want to say a few words. Over to you, David.
Yeah, and I mean, I can also just share more around the case study, but effectively, it was an initiative that was led between the government and the private sector in South Africa, with a number of the large corporates and financial institutions committing funding to this fund. Basically, the government initially committed a certain amount, and they allocated funding from a very large pension fund scheme that we have in South Africa. The private sector then matched it, and then it's been managed by a third party, which is housed under the name the SASME Fund. And that fund basically had different types of investments that they were responsible for. So they were supposed to be an enabler fund, investing in other funds that were directly investing in SMEs and startups, investing in training for fund managers as well, so that they could help in terms of building the capacity and skills of funds as well. When they set up, one of the things that there just wasn't as many fund managers around. So they also had to seed some first-time fund managers. They also had an explicit focus on socioeconomic outcomes in the country. So they had a priority on Black fund managers and female fund managers as well. Yeah, I can share more around how they kind of came up with that structure as well, and what the different amounts were and how they got the funding together and what some of those investments had been. but I think that's probably, at the highest level, kind of how they set that up. And I think the major takeaway that I would have is they got in a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it might be the same in India, is that they actually have allocations within their pension funds to invest in private equity, but they often are very below those targets. They primarily invest in government bonds and real estate. And so they can often increase allocations to, private equity or these fund structures, and they just need that kind of incentive to be able to do that. And they also, I think the second bit that was really powerful from it was the fact that local financial institutions came together and also committed funding as well. And that we've also now seen recently in Egypt under a program called Include. So I think the government can use a variety of different tools to really catalyze private funding into that space. And I think if you can align it with kind of the wider socioeconomic objectives or policies of the country, that seems to be a critical success factor as well.
Thanks, Max. Or Lina, I don't know.
Yes, just to complete David's answer, which was already pretty clear. Thank you, David. I think it's important to see SME funds as complementary to the other more risky funds like VC, business angels, or the type of private funds, in a way that they are really necessary in financing things like R&D, especially in the Agtech sector, which is something that cannot only be financed by the government or private sector, but we really need investment funds as well to be implemented in Agtech R&D, because that is where innovation comes from as well. And it's at the beginning of the value chain, but it's really important before VC funds can then get into the value chain and finance the startups that get out of these universities and research organizations.
Thanks to all of you. So before I give the floor to Parmesh, just want to highlight that we're very happy to organize, as mentioned at the beginning, some government-to-government conversations. We are trying to do this with La French Tech, with Morocco. Hopefully we might be able to think this through with Madagascar, 2 different countries with 2 very different backgrounds, but there's always something useful in hearing some of the different tools that even in high-income countries have been used, because it demystifies a little bit, how the government can support, even in these kind of ecosystems, the development of these startups. So Parmesh, over to you now to bring in some knowledge from our TTLs and your own, actually. Thanks. Over to you.
I really appreciate the participation of many teams. To acknowledge John Kaiser from Sri Lanka, Asuka from Nepal, and Arshia from India, and then Winston was developing a new program in Peru, and Yuvraj from IFC, who are designing an Agtech fund in India. So there's a good quality of participants is very high. Now I'll just take a couple of questions because we have answers of some of the things which we are doing in that area. And I want to also highlight some things we're going to do next year, because this is an opportunity for us to talk about that. So on the data side, I think clearly we have made progress on creating some open data platforms. And not all data is open, but significant amount of data, and creating those kind of data platforms which can be used by startups and which brings all the government data on digital farm registries, geotag plots, the research data in Kenya with Calro, which has been digitized on all the technologies which have been developed in research stations. So I think the major first investment is investment in digital public infrastructure, digitizing farms, and also the technologies and research which is lying scattered. The second part is creating an open data platform which is accessible to various kinds of Agtech startups. So I think in Kenya, a lot of this data is now available through a governance mechanism, which is a kind of sitting in the government right now, but eventually we are looking at a public-private governance platforms where data could be shared, because obviously Agtechs want to monetize that. So you need to build some controls and safeguards for that data, if it's publicly invested, to be converted into a private service or a private good. So I think we have now examples on that, and that's, as Mary Agnes said, if you are interested in a conversation with those governments which have cracked some part of the problem, then we would definitely engage if you are interested, conversations with them there. But the big thing which we are going to work on from this year is helping governments not just build a data platform, but an AI engine, which is really brings all the scattered data at the back end and then convert that into accessible data, like chatbots for SMEs, chatbots for farmers, chatbots for a lot of startups, so that all this data is more readily accessible to people. Currently, the way we access this data is very old school. And I think we're going to try this in some of the new projects where we will work with Microsoft, Gates Foundation, OpenAI to really create an AI engine for future investment. And this is an area where if you are interested, please feel free to get in touch with us. And we are ready. If you are especially designing a new project, I think they have to become AI content enabled from day one. If they are not, then we spend a lot of time, startups spend a lot of time, and government spend a lot of time on really accessing data in a very kind of an old school kind of way, and that doesn't lead to changes there. In terms of follow-up, I would like to see if people who are still on the call can talk a little bit about what would they expect us to do in future, because this is a good time for us to ask you. So I hope you don't mind if I bring you in and ask you to respond. You can respond in whichever way you want. So I'll start with Winston first. What is your ask from us in terms of what you are starting in Peru? Winston, a brief intervention from your side.
Ah, Ash, Amish, can you all hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Very good, thank you. No, I realized I was unmuted and my camera was not on, so great. No, thank you very much for everyone. Briefly, we're working, my colleagues and I were working on with the government in Peru. The government clearly has realized that for the agriculture sector to move to the next level, in terms of not beyond extension, mechanization, productivity, etc., it has to bring in this new element of information, agricultural information. And so government has developed an integrated agriculture statistics platform that it currently has. However, it still has several areas of weaknesses that are tied to it. And part of it also is, allude to the question that I probably put in the chat, is that Peru has these three regions, the coastal area, the Sierra, and the Selva. So depending on connectivity, which is clear, one of the key drivers, is different across the regions. The farmers themselves, the beneficiaries, as well as the agtechs in each of these three regions are also different. So the question is how to develop models to address the needs of individuals in these three regions. They can't change the geographic of the country, it's what it is. The question is, each of these areas have certain levels of production and needs. And so I think through what government is hoping to do is through this integrated platform, using some of what Pamesh has mentioned, even the AI, increase the geospatial mapping, the agtech technology in terms of smart farming, etc. It's really to coalesce all of this information into a much more coherent, strategic approach. So the bank in general we are working with government to help them to do that through various trust funds we're looking at, as well as an actual operation, so that we're still in this discussion with the government on. So I mean, I think this is the general angle where we're going with Peru. It's still, I would say, the agtech is still at a very early nascent stage, quite frankly, even though Peru is a middle income country. But they've been doing a lot more of the traditional productive alliance models, which a lot of people know about, family farming, etc. But the government wants to move beyond that because that's such huge potential for export, huge potential for developing new markets. So this is where, but they realize that technology And the information system is actually helping them to drive this, to be able to do more linkages of businesses, linkages of farmers, linkages of small businesses, etc. So I think that is the piece that they find that is missing. And the first part is the data, as Aparmesh said. They're trying to build this robust database, and then from that they can then spread out into the actual the platform that makes it be open for everyone, accessible, and then bringing in AI and other aspects. So I'll stop there. Happy to go.
Thanks a lot, Winston. This is a very good
Limit
context.
time limit.
Yeah, no, I think we will engage with you more systematically, and I think we'll go upstream with you on helping you solve some of the challenges you are talking about. One of the things I want to mention, Winston, with the new digital transformation VPU coming in, they have taken agriculture as a high impact case, and we will be working very closely on joint operations between digital and agriculture teams. So the connectivity issue, we're going to come from the digital side and make sure that issues you are raising about connectivity are solved from the infrastructure side, from the digital side. So we will come back to you. We have a retreat with the digital team. We'll invite you on the connectivity issue on that also, because Peru will require a different solution of different technology solutions also on connectivity, because we have Starlink and lots of others coming and providing connectivity in a different way. And the Peru might provide us some opportunity to test some of those ideas as well. So we'll come back to you on that, Winston. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I go now to, I want to draw all the people who are here and who are the TTLs, who are the real deal, who will make this work on the ground. So I would like Asuka first, then Arshia, then Yuvraj, and then I think we would like also other people. I will mention them one by one. We go a little bit 5 minutes late. Please don't mind. This is our opportunity to hear from our TTLs. Asuka, you want to go ahead?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I really enjoy. Thank you very much. I would love to follow up these two groups. I'm currently working from Nepal, and apparently we have a similar situation with Peru as a mountainous country. Initiatives exist already in Nepal, but most of them are project driven and tend to be abandoned. Then the government is willing to develop an integrated gateway or a platform for such platform for farmers to access to these existing solutions while expecting this solution to be sustainably maintained or operated by relevant private or public parties. So for that, I think this ecosystem approach is really a good model. But as I asked, the cultural things seems to be a quite big barrier. People are mentally ready for it. So that's the area I really want to work with your team to really materialize this ecosystem in the country. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Asuka. So I'll go to Arshia, Yuvraj, and then I think I will also go to the digital team, and because we have a good representation from that team there. So I'll come back to the digital GP in Africa, what they're doing, Tata, particularly Tata, and then probably if time permits, GI. So Arshia, over to you.
Thanks, Parmesh. Thanks, everybody. I think it was a really, really insightful clinic, and just limiting it to a very focused discussion really made things very clear. So, Parmesh, going forward, a couple of things. I think I also raised some of them in my questions, but I think going forward, I would perhaps really like to know that what are some of the good use cases in which private sector has been able to leverage public data for effective service delivery. Even if it is from the non-ag sectors, I think it'll be good to know, how these sectors have dovetailed into public data, and perhaps we can also draw some inspiration from them. So that's perhaps one of the things that I would really look forward to in the coming sessions. The other is how can we use AI more effectively, particularly for smallholder farmers? Because adoption amongst large farmers is pretty good, something which can be driven, and they see the value. But it's really the smallholder farmers who actually need these interventions more. So if there are some good use cases around the world, again, even from outside ag sectors, would be useful to know that how have these data sets have been used more effectively, and how AI has been instrumental in that. And certainly, last but not the least, again, my question is on the adoption. Mary Agnes mentioned that there are some of the models where government has subsidized or incentivized use of some digital tech on ground. So if there are some use cases like that, that would also be useful, and perhaps we could integrate some of those in our projects going forward. So I'll stop here. Once again, thank you very much for this clinic, and I really hope that some of these things can also be addressed. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Arshia. Great asks from you, and that helps us develop our program. Yuvraj, over to you. Yuvraj, are you able to connect? So we're finding it difficult for Yuvraj. So Tata, can you come in?
Hi, Pamesh. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity and the wonderful seminar clinic that was presented. So from the digital VP, I think that we are very much interested in carrying out more projects and activities when it comes to digital agriculture. There are quite a lot of projects, and which might also respond to some comments that participants have had related to connectivity, to data, to interoperability, which are actually projects that we are rolling out in most of the countries that we work in Africa particularly. And our priority right now, we've been following discussions that we're also having with the agriculture GP, really is to ensure that for every connectivity project that we're having, and we have a lot more alignment towards providing internet connectivity to major agriculture production basins, but also ensuring rural connectivity for areas which do not have this yet in local areas, or upgrading the areas that have just 2G connectivity to 3G and beyond. And this is just from the connectivity side, right? Because you need access to information, you need coverage to grow the different businesses that startups and organizations have there. But also from the digital public infrastructure side, we are also implementing quite a couple of projects now. That priority is also to link the different farmer registries to the digital ID that is being built up in these countries, to identify the farmers, to permit every service that is provided to the farmers to go beyond just this, but also link it up to other digital services in the country on a wider scale, to support interoperability of systems and of data, particularly for the agriculture sector, but also expanding it to other sectors that would need that data. And also, as one of the quick wins, really to see how for most of our projects where we do have support to the innovation ecosystem, both for digital entrepreneurship, but also support to developing advanced digital skills to ensure that we have a much more streamlined approach to responding to solutions that are sectorally focused. So what we can do on digital, on Agtech, what we can do on health tech, what we can do on EdTech, rather than just having agnostic support, as has been the case in the past. So I think these are discussions that we are having now with the agriculture GP to ensure that for the different operations that we have, we prioritize it and be able to support the innovation system effectively. And I also like the way David presented his approach earlier on, which would be actually useful, not just looking at it from the Agtech side, but also this is the kind of idea that we want to use to develop the different innovation systems all across the countries we work in Africa. And many more projects are being developed and implemented around this. I'll stop here for now.
Thanks a lot, Tata. I look forward to this collaboration between digital, because I think the skills, entrepreneurship, and the ecosystem are not just agriculture issues. They are across the economy kind of issues. That it's the whole of how you develop the digital economy of a country and how do you have certain sectors becoming drivers there. So I think more collaboration, focused collaboration in certain countries accompanied by upstream diagnostic, the kind of one which we are launching now, together with you would be very useful. So I think we look forward to that. It's a big opportunity in the institution when we are realigning ourselves for digital to become a cross-cutting enabler for a lot of sectors. So final, I think, word before you lose people, I think Jihai, can you come in? Jihai leads a lot of our operations in Africa. And so Jihai, your perspective.
Thank you, Pramesh. Thank you so much for this wonderful webinar. Sorry, I joined really late as I was on a virtual mission to Rwanda. But I think we discussed the use cases and digital economy, and there are now full set of use cases on farmers' adoption and driving the digital economy from the agriculture sector in Africa, and also building the digital entrepreneurship. And there is also the report that Pramesh and I worked on a few years back on what it means to enable the ecosystem for Agtech entrepreneurs to scale up, right? So we have tested a few methodologies in Africa, and there's now really the impact evaluation on some of the Agtech entrepreneurs that we worked with in the scope of World Bank Finance project, which really meant that farmers adopting technology from the marketplace with government subsidies, and which then helped expanding the market for agri-tech entrepreneurs, which then bring a very strong signal to the private sector that there is this very strong and positive push from the public side to scale the agtech startups and also scale the adoption level by the farmers, so they come with their own investment and with more contracts. So we built some use cases there. I think definitely from Africa there will be a lot of chances to do a south learning, but we need to go bigger. We need to go as an institution, we need to go bigger. And I'm very, very glad that digital and agriculture are now doing in a more systematic way partnerships. And I'm happy to join also with Tata to think more in that sense. So I guess we can do a lot of region to region, and also not just South, but then with other economies like, France and Korea. We've done some with Korea and India as well. Much more of this cross-regional fertilization of digital economy development, also led by agriculture. So happy to share any of these, the things that I mentioned in terms of the use cases in Uganda and Kenya, where I lead operations. And happy to be connected with InSkip today. And we'll continue this. And thanks for hosting again a wonderful webinar, Pramesh.
So before I hand over to you, Mary Agnes, back on the next step. So I think the main challenge we have is that TTLs, when they're designing a project, a new investment, we don't have a structured innovation diagnostics on the startup ecosystem. So if we can codify that through the kinds of things we talked about today, and that becomes an integral part of our investment, that we have that diagnostics available, and then also then where should we invest? So public good, it's dangerous to invest in public good in areas where private good is going to come. So you have a fine line between what is the enabler kind of investment we have to do. And so I think if we can develop guidance for all our teams on how they should invest in that area and what is the diagnostic behind that. These two will be very important inputs, and I think both the presentations today, I think, will allow us to build that thing. So the toolkits definitely is required, but I think we need people who can facilitate this within countries and work with our teams and our client teams also. So thanks a lot for also our active community of practice which joined today, because the success of Clinic is not by what we say from the supply side. And we have to really be conscious about what the demand side, which is all our investment managers, task team leaders, who are the real investors. They have invested almost like more than $1 billion in these things. So they are very keen to know whether that's working, how it's working. And as GI said, we are now launching a full impact evaluation of our 5 years work in Kenya. And that will give us good results also, which will help us decide what to invest and how to invest in. So thanks a lot. I really appreciate the INSCIP, both Lena and Maxime and David from Beta Bridges for your excellent contributions today. Okay. And Marie Agnes, can you announce the next steps? Don't end it with the webinar or a clinic. Say what's going to happen next.
Very brief. I mentioned I think we should have a bit of a package of information to send to the testing leaders. We'll bring things together. What's been done, what's in the pipeline. I think, Parmesh, we're thinking about this event maybe on the 25th, so that would be another opportunity to talk about this. And next step in terms of the pilots that David is leading, we will make this call for interest, and with maybe a few questions or help TTLs understand a bit better what this is all about. But very much, as you said, we're here to listen to what the need is, how we really create something that really is going to be helpful to everyone. So very much looking forward to the next steps and interacting with you all. And if you have any questions or want to get in touch with INSCIP and Beta Bridges, of course, we will put you in touch, and even ideas of government to government conversations, others. Very happy to explore that with everyone. So thanks everyone for being there. Always too short, by the way. I feel like we were just getting warmed up, but next time, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.